Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm very happy to be here. It reminds me of times where I was spending almost, I feel like I was here every week when I was leading the Center for Intersectional Justice. And for this event and the opening, I would like to open up another perspective. And I would like us to maybe step out of the institution we're in today and try to imagine, because the theme of today is also trying to reimagine anti-racism, right? So we are at a crossroad, we're going through a crisis, and that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity, a portal that we can use, a doorway that we can use to maybe change the way we've been doing things so far. So I'd like to open this up. I am not tied to any institution. I have the freedom to do this, and also, keynote speeches are also meant for that. You can then after go back to the action plans and all the structures and the frames, the institutional frames in which this work is taking place. But for a moment, I'd like to take us beyond. And I know that it's difficult because we're finding ourselves in a very loaded institution. And I would like to emphasize what effect it has as well, thematically speaking. To be in institutions like the European Parliament, like the European Commission, only coming in is also already showing us that it's a very privileged space, right? It's a very elitist space. It's not a place where you can just come in. It's not a place. So there's a physical barrier to what's taking place on the street. There's a physical barrier that is also signaling that there's a certain way of speaking, that there's a certain way of being, that there's a certain way of dressing that is deemed appropriate or not. And I think it's important to really realize what it does to our bodies entering those spaces. So the context in which we're speaking is a context of a massive attack on anti-racism, a massive attack on all movements, all liberation movements that are centered around marginalized identities. And I think I would like to emphasize that here because, sorry for a moment, I think my mouse is somewhere here. Yeah, it's over there. Let me get it here. I'm really sorry that. Sorry, I have lost it. So it's. Oh, okay, it's here. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so we're talking about movements that are centered around marginalized identities, right? So the so-called identity politics. And identity politics has been under attack for, I would say, the past 5 years. It has started to become palpable in the discourse, but it has reached new heights in the last 18 months. And so what are we talking about when we're speaking about identity politics, right? So we're speaking about movements that are centered around identities that have been cast and constructed as inferior, that have been dehumanized, as we've been seeing as well in the opening panel. And so what is important to notice is that those movements were meant to understand that the discrimination, the oppression, the inequalities, the injustice, that the basis of this is a line of the human that has been created as superior or inferior. So we're talking about the anti-racism movement, we're speaking about the movement for the rights of LGBTQI people, we're speaking about the Me Too movement, the movement for the rights of women, of non-binary people. We're speaking about the disability justice movement, but also, even if it's not centered around a particular identity, but around our human identity, the climate justice movement. And I think it's quite interesting to not leaving out of identity movements, simply because it has the power to catalyze the idea that we're interconnected, not by way of universalist thinking that claims that we're just one race, so racism doesn't really exist, but more so to understand that all those struggles and all those inequalities and injustices are linked with each other. And initially, we're losing sight of the fact that identity politics as a term was coined by the Combahee River Collective in 1977. The Combahee River Collective is a collective of Afro-American lesbian women. And so they said, this focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. And so here we have strategic essentialism that was very important in understanding that the agency and the centering of marginalized voices was a critical step in anti-racist work, a critical step in social justice movements. It is a long time ago. It was in 1977. And I see that we may have experienced a trap in social movements for social justice, for intersectional justice, namely a neoliberal trap, where we stopped at the identities, or we stopped at the naming of identities, and failed to recognize the importance of dismantling the systems that are producing these identities. And it is so much easier to stay stuck in the identity trap, in the identitarian trap, which is nevertheless necessary, but it prevents us from moving forward because it individualizes the issues that are at stake, right? So it means that it compartmentalises the different social injustices. And as it was also mentioned in the panel, the divide and rule strategy thrives in a climate where identities are at the center of action, of political action. I will come back to that later. And so what is the identity politics crisis that is currently taking place, right? We see that it's been criticized for being divisive, for leading to cancel culture, for being polarizing, for leading to reverse discrimination, even going too far because, hey, we don't see race, so why do we need identity politics? And there has been a culmination of the attack and the bashing of identity politics that took place right after October 7th. And it was led by a tweet that has been quite influential in the ways in which these different struggles have been cast as dangerous, have been cast as obsolete, right? So this generalized attack, and I will read this tweet. Conservatives need to create a strong association between Hamas, Black Lives Matter, DSA, and academic decolonization in the public mind. Connect the dots, then attack, delegitimize, and discredit. Make the center-left disavow them. Make them political untouchables. And so these tactics have been put in place in the United States, of course, because this is where it originated. In Germany, where I come from, these tactics have been, used with a lot of zeal, even I would say. But it's been the same here, in most European countries. And so what we have seen is not just conservatives, but it has become something that has moved to the center, that have moved mainstream. And I realize this because when people read my bio, what I see is that, when I'm presented as being a scholar of decolonial thought, a scholar of queer feminism, a scholar of gender studies, then I feel that these are no longer neutral terms that define an expertise. They are very politically loaded terms that are used to discredit me and people like me and a whole thought and a whole discourse, a whole movement. And so what we see as well, concomitantly to this, is the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism by the far right in practically all European countries, including in the United States, as we blatantly see right now. And here's an example of Marine Le Pen saying, the Front National has always been a Zionist party. And so I wish we could really, wholeheartedly laugh and really understand the absurdity of it, because it is utterly absurd, but it is working, right? We see that this instrumentalization has been extremely effective. It has been extremely effective simply because it rests on the idea of white supremacy, right? On a proximity, on a created, constructed proximity of Jewishness to, the Aryan race. When we speak about Marine Le Pen, for example, or other far-right parties, right? And so what we see is here that the anti-racist or the anti-fascist movements, because people will say, yes, but in Germany, there have been a lot of mobilization against the AfD, a lot of mobilization against fascism, so it gives me hope. Well, it would give me hope if this was not entirely performative or predominantly performative, right? So performative anti-fascism is something that we need to be very worried about. And we can see this here in Germany with, anti-AfD protests with people with the same breath supporting a very fascist state, a very fascist government, right? So here we see a double standard that is very difficult, that is very dangerous, and that leads further to a very difficult, dangerous situation for a specific group that is cast as the danger and that doesn't stir empathy. And that's the plight of Muslim people, right? So it means that anti-Muslim racism, anti-Arab racism has risen tremendously exactly in the moment where the Palestinian people are facing genocide. And so here we see the sheer absurdity and the lack of rationality behind these discourses, behind these movements. And so I wanted to just show the situation in which we're finding ourselves, and at the same time, opening up to a change that we need to undergo, right? Because what we see is that the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, the rising anti-Muslim sentiment and racism and violence worldwide, the denial of this violence, because it goes hand in hand, right? Violence is physical, material violence, and at the same time, the denial that it's taking place. It's something that should let us ask ourselves, what change do we need? And mainly, how does our anti-racism look like? And what do we need to change in this anti-racism? So anti-racism as a term, I think, needs a bit of, we need to challenge this term. We need to understand that maybe it's time to move beyond, right? To move beyond anti-racism. Simply because the word anti, or the struggle against, or the fight against is something that we need, right? So we need to fight against, we need to defend ourselves, so this is something that is true. And at the same time, it's an investment, right? It's a commitment to the very thing that we're fighting against. If you're an anti-racist, or if you're invested in anti-racism, you're committed to racism, right? And so that's something that we may not understand, because we feel, no, we're doing everything against it, but by dissecting racism, by observing racism, by speaking about racism all the time, it's a lot of energy that flows towards it, right? It's a lot of energy that flows towards the system, because bad attention or negative attention is better than no attention at all. So what we don't notice is that by constantly looking towards racism and dissecting it and complaining about it or wanting to eliminate it, what we are doing essentially is feeding the system. And we're feeding it also by being in an institution, and it was also talked about by Nyanchama Okemwa. What I find interesting is that there are two Europes, right? And the same institutions that are creating the human rights violations on the borders of the European Union are the same that are welcoming us here today. And so I don't want to look at an institution as something that is monolithic, something that lacks heterogeneity. But power, or where power is located, is still very important here, right? And so that's why it's, I think, quite relevant to ask ourselves what role we are playing when we're within these institutions, giving the impression that we're actually changing systems that cannot be changed from that standpoint. So it shouldn't be something that delegitimizes the work that is being done at the European Commission, or saying that people who are engaged in anti-racism work within these institutions are not honest. Absolutely not. But I want to speak to the power of, or at least I want to speak to the power dynamics that are at play here. So instead of speaking about anti-racism, it's about a shift, right? It's not about saying we have done it wrong so far. It's about really understanding that sometimes we're at turning points and it's important to shift the way we've been doing things. So I'm thinking that maybe focusing our efforts on post-racism, of understanding what a post-racist society could be, and of really imagining, right? So it's about reimagining anti-racism, really imagining what a post-racist society looks like. Do we even know that? I mean, I know that for a very long time, I couldn't even imagine it because I was so focused thinking about what racism, the atrocious violence that racism is inflicting on non-white bodies all across Europe. We're speaking about Europe here, but also beyond, of course. And so what does it feel like? What does a post-racist life feel like? What would it be like to move through a world that is post-racist? How would we be with each other? What would our conversations be like? What would this space, what could this space generate in terms of ideas, in terms of visions, in terms of connectivity, in terms of solidarity? So it's about a shift because we have it all in us, like it's already there. I think everything that is bringing us together here today is really this idea that we want this world. We really want to move beyond this violence. And so it's about how to shift it and how to embody these visions. So why we moved through a post-racist frame or a post-racist paradigm? I think we can ask ourselves as well the way it has been framed so far. Right? So racism has been framed as something that is external to us, something that is a virus and it just catches us without us knowing it. And so what do you do if you want to get rid of a virus? Well, you protect yourself, you get stronger, you make your immune system stronger, and you're not focusing on the virus itself, but also on the environment. In which environment does the virus thrive, in which environment, what are the conditions that make a virus strong? And here what I like is that we have this picture with a man with a suit, which symbolically, of course, it doesn't say anything about him, but symbolically he represents power, right? So we should be very careful of institutions and governments telling us that they're fighting a very system that they rest on, that is vital for the perpetuation of this type of power. And so how do we move to this post-racist frame? Well, from an intersectional standpoint, I've shown you all the movements that we're talking about. Racism is inseparable from the other movements for liberation because they all rest on a global social hierarchy between humans, but also between humans and the rest of the universe, right? And so we need to move from an ego paradigm that is pyramidal, that rests on hierarchies, that rests on a binary, and that is so ingrained in our brains, in our bodies, that we fail to even recognize that it exists, right? So for those who know my work, I always encompass speciesism to the intersectional fight or the intersectional frame for justice. Simply because the dehumanization of Palestinian people, the dehumanization of Black people, the dehumanization of the African continent, the dehumanization of people with disabilities, the dehumanization of people who have been historically disenfranchised and oppressed rests on the ingrained idea that not being human is a justification for exploitation, for murder, for destruction, right? So in order to move beyond that, we need to understand that this paradigm needs to shift to an eco-paradigm, a paradigm where hierarchies are dismantled and where interconnectedness and interdependence are at the center. And so it means really moving beyond the frame that has taught us that there are human races that are ingrained in nature and that our hierarchies are naturalized, that those hierarchies are biologized, etc. And so it means that we need to understand difference from a different angle. It's not about erasing difference. It's not about considering differences in and of themselves as the problem, but it's about dismantling the hierarchy in which they are embedded. And we need to focus on that hierarchy almost only, and no longer spend time really looking at our differences and dissecting them and claiming them as identity traits that are assets or deficits or better or worse or this binary thinking that is very poisonous. So if we move beyond the differences, what we can do is arrive at a place, and I'm using an analogy because ecology and ecology is intertwined with justice. It's, in my mind, impossible to come to justice or to fight injustice without resorting to the land, without resorting to ecology as a system that carries us and in which we're deeply embedded, even if we're forgetting that. And so let's take an analogy with mushrooms. Millions of species of fungi and bacteria swap nutrients between soil and the roots of trees, forming a vast interconnected web of organisms throughout the woods. So the trees act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. What we see is the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. We can starve together or feast together. And so that's the botanist Robin Wall-Kimmerer who has written this. And so now, I want to invite us to move through another frame. Like, imagine that everything is possible and that we can, or let's imagine, the catastrophic scenarios that we have, that, there's no funding anymore for anti-racism. That INAR as an organization and all the organizations that are here end up disappearing because there's no funding. So this is a dire scenario, but that's also a scenario with a lot of opportunities that come with it. Right? Because this money is also something that keeps us trapped in a system that just dictates us how to act, how to fight for justice. And it's something that is stripping us of our potential to reimagine, to really truly reimagine how the world could be without racism. And so imagine that this would happen. It wouldn't be the end of anti-racism, because the spirit of it, the energy of it is within us. Nothing can take it away from us. And so identifying too strongly with institutions and corporatism as a way of, like a modality of action can be problematic. Because even if these institutions disappear, we have the power of connectivity. It will always survive. This is what has kept us alive so far. The reason why we're alive today is really this spirit, this interconnectivity between us. It's the spirit of community. It's the force of solidarity and communal help, right? We're not here alive because of financial markets. We're not here alive because, there are social benefits. That's not the reason. And so it's really about connecting to our true essence from an ecological point of view. And so let us imagine what this could look like. Right? So how do we move to a utopian state? So I've chosen an image here that can help us get out of the frames that we have in our heads about what life is, what society is like, what we need to fight for. And so maybe if we all take that for the next 2 days and enable ourselves to no longer feel the fear and the despair that has been injected in us for the past, I would say very intentionally for the past 5 years, and reclaim our own power, I think it would be tremendously helpful, because without realizing it, this catastrophic thinking is just feeding the very system that we're fighting against. And so there are a few energies that are very critical in that time, and that we need to focus our attention towards, right? And these are the energies that are found in all of these movements, because again, they are a true essence, because I think that we have a deep search for justice. It's a philosophical question here, but it can also be found in the non-human world. It's found in animals as well that have a deep sense for justice. So this is something that is within us. And it comes through anger, because injustice triggers anger. And anger is an emotion that tends to be pathologized, that tends to be seen as unacceptable, that tends to be discredited or made illegitimate. And so I think reclaiming that anger and transmuting it into care for each other, understanding that if we're angry, it's because we care for justice. It's because we care for each other. So welcoming anger as an emotion that is coming to tell us messages that we need to listen to. And then understanding that care and anger together can lead to love, and that love is the energy that will save us. It's not funding. It's not the money that is going to be poured in our projects. It's not the recognition, the institutional recognition that we're going to receive, because this is going to fade. We can be sure about this. With the fascization of Europe, it's a matter of years until this disappears. but it will not mean the end, that's for sure. And I think we need to be sure about this. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion. I have put some QR codes here if you want to follow my work. Thank you so much.